Well, guys, it's good to see you this morning. Hope that everything is going well. Beverly wanted to stay for another month with there. It was just absolutely amazing. We were in Kauai. The kids took us, and so it was the kids and the grandkids, and we all stayed over there and watched the green sea turtles come in at night. There were the place where we were staying at that particular beach is the only place in Kauai where they do it. But about 40 turtles every night come and rest on that beach. And it was just really, really pretty amazing. You can't touch them, by the way. Although my father-in-law used to cook them and eat them. He started the work in 1956 down in Pearl Harbor. And we took him back in 2006 to preach for the 50th anniversary of that church. And I found it really interesting as we were talking about it there, that we went to one beach in Oahu where the turtles are always there day and night, and he was standing there right next to the ranger that was making sure we didn't touch the turtles, and he said, they taste really good. And I thought, oh, we're in trouble, but anyway, it was really a wonderful trip. I found a lot of interesting things I didn't know about Kauai. It's the quiet side of of Hawaii. If you ever want to go and you don't want to be in a lot of traffic, that's a great place to be. 82% of the island is not inhabited, and so the only way you can get to it is by helicopter, which we did, and that was great. We had just some wonderful experiences there. Very few really nice restaurants, mostly mom and pop places that serve all kinds of unique, great food. So it was good. I gained 2 pounds. But we had a really good time. All right, we are talking about in this class, are we the church of the New Testament? We laid out at the first the organization and structure of the church, the purpose and function of the church. We've talked about all of that, and then we began to talk about last week specific churches, because the emphasis of this, at least when I talked to Adam Hobgood when he set this up, was we don't want to necessarily just talk about the structure and organization, although we do, but we want to talk about how do we compare to the churches of the New Testament. So sometimes we are not like some of the churches of the New Testament, and that's a good thing. And sometimes we are like some of the churches of the New Testament, and that's a bad thing, because they were made up of people just like us, and they had all kinds of problems just like us. So we looked at the church at Ephesus last week, and the church at Ephesus did a lot of things that we need to be doing. We need to be correct doctrinally. We need to oppose those that are teaching false doctrine. We need to do all of that. But the problem before Ephesus was they had left their first love, okay? And Barry and I have slightly different views on what that first love was. But I just want to tell you that it's possible to do all the right things, but not be doing it for the right reason. And that was the problem of the early church. There in Ephesus, they were doing a lot of the right things, but they were doing it for the wrong reasons. And that brings us over to chapter 2 of the book of Revelation, verses 8 through 11, where he talks about where the angel of the church in Smyrna is written to. And that's the one that I want us to look at today. And somebody read that, verses 8 through 11.
And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into the prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death.
I find it interesting the way that he addresses every one of these churches tells you that John knows some history about all of these churches, or the way the Lord does it. The Lord's very clearly aware of the history of the area of these churches, and it comes out in every one of the letters, which I find really interesting. All of them begin with, to the angel of the church at whichever one of the churches there was. I think I mentioned this before, if I haven't already. He mentioned 7 churches in Asia. There are, in fact, a lot more churches than 7 in Asia. But these 7 represent the problems that the church is going to have throughout all the ages. And what they're experiencing is what we tend to experience in our time. And so it has a specific resonance with with our time. When Jesus speaks to the angel of the church, and I think we mentioned this one already too, he's talking about the messenger of the church. Angelos means messenger, and he's talking to the messenger of the church. And that messenger would clearly be the preacher or the preaching elder, whatever that happened to be in that particular congregation. But the one who regularly proclaimed the gospel to them is the messenger or angel of the church. And so he sends this to the angel of the church. And while it looks like he's saying this only about the angel of the church, he's talking clearly in context to the entire church, not just to the one who's giving the message. So it's a message through that messenger to the entire church. And every one of them ends with, "He who has an ear, let him hear." Every single time he's saying, "Listen to what I'm telling you." And notice what he says each time. "He that has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches," not to that church particularly, but to the churches. In other words, it's to everybody. What's said here is said for the edification of everybody. Smyrna is an interesting town. The premier town of all of Asia was Ephesus, so it's kind of normal that Ephesus would be the first one that he would write to. But the most beautiful town in all of Asia was Smyrna. It sat at the end of the Aegean, at an arm of the Aegean Sea, and if you look at a map of it, you're going to find out that it was the best harbor in the ancient world. It was one of the great harbors of the ancient world. There were all kinds of things from the Hermus Valley that came through from all the way out from India and other things. The roads that led to there came back through Smyrna. And so Smyrna was a trading city, and it was a very popular city, and it was a planned city. Let me just tell you that Smyrna began about 1,000 years before Christ, but it was destroyed. It was destroyed by enemies who came and absolutely wiped them out. But then prior to about 100 or 200, about 150 years prior, I have to look back to be sure on that, but it was rebuilt, and it was rebuilt as one of the world's first planned cities, so that when you looked at Smyrna, every road was laid out. It didn't go every which way. It was laid out on purpose exactly the way it was. And it was one of the most beautiful cities on earth. The goddess Cybele was worshipped there. And some of the ancient writers, like Aristides, described Smyrna as the goddess Cybele, whose feet were in the water, whose torso was the hills and plains, and whose crown was Mount Pagos, which was behind the city, which had all of these wonderful temples on the top of it, beautiful temples that were on the top of it. There was a prevailing west wind that always blew through the streets, so that they had some of the best weather of any. The only problem with that prevailing west wind was that they tended to put their sewage out into the Aegean Sea, and if the wind blew wrong right after you did the sewage, it didn't smell so great in the town. Other than that, it was really a great place and a wonderful city in it. But when he says, "This is the Christ who was dead and is alive again," that's exactly what happened to this city. For over 400 years, it was dead. There wasn't anything there. And then it was built back as a planned city. So the point is that they would have understood death to life. That's really what happened there. And that's what Smyrna was really all about. Great trade city. And by the way, let me just say one other thing. Before Rome became a world power, Smyrna was the first city in Asia to say, "We cast our lot with Rome." And when Rome was in real trouble at one point, this again, before they became a world power, they were in real trouble and their soldiers were wounded and hurting and their supplies were cut off. The people of Smyrna sent their own clothes to the Roman soldiers so that they could be clothed and all the money that they could find to help them win that battle. And so they were rewarded. Once Rome became a world power, it became one of the great places. There are some other things that are kind of interesting about Smyrna. Homer apparently was born there. The great poet was apparently born there. The Christians, I think the thing that stands out about Smyrna outside of this letter is Polycarp. Polycarp was an elder in the church, in the early church, and during the times of persecution, he was taken and imprisoned, and then on Saturday, February 23rd, 155 AD, he was burned at the stake. All he had to do, in fact, the city officials who were under pressure from higher sources didn't really want to kill him. And they said, all you have to do is say Caesar is Lord. You don't even have to say Jesus isn't. All you have to say is Caesar is Lord, and you will be spared from being burned at the stake. And I found it interesting that his answer was, and let's see if I can find it here. I'm gonna find it. Let's see. You threaten me with fire that burns for a time and is quickly quenched. For you do not know the fire which awaits the wicked at the judgment to come and an everlasting punishment. Why are you waiting? Come, do what you will. That's the way he answered them. I love Polycarp. He said, for 80 years I have served him. Why would I not serve him now? I just find that very fascinating, but that's something that happened in 155 BC. So here we go. I'm going to move past that. I have a whole lot of history here, but he says something in verses 8 through 11 that's really important. He says there are three things. It was in trouble, he says, and the danger in trial are imminent. He says, you're going to be tried 10 days. Things are going to happen. You're already under pressure. And he uses several words which I find interesting. Thalipsis is one of the words that he uses to describe it. Thalipsis means crushing beneath a weight or putting something in a vice and squeezing it to the point that it cracks. He says, that's where you are. He said, that's the kind of persecution you're under. And then he says, and I know your poverty. There are a couple of words that are used in the New Testament for poverty. One of them means not having very much, so that you're always struggling. But the other word for poverty means having nothing. And that's the word that he uses here. There were trade guilds that if you didn't say Caesar is Lord and you didn't worship their particular trade god, then in fact you wouldn't be able to find any kind of employment. So when you look at this church, if you attended on Sunday at this church, okay, first of all, you would see people who are under tremendous pressure. Secondly, the contribution is going to be low, okay, because nobody has anything, okay? Nobody in this church has anything. They are poverty-stricken. You say, man, this is not a very good church. It's kind of a poverty-stricken church that's going on here. And then he says he will cast some of you in prison 10 days. So they're under pressure. They have nothing. And they're getting ready to go be thrown in prison. Some of them are getting ready to be thrown in prison, and that's what's happening. And by the way, that's exactly the way it happened there. That's exactly what happened to this congregation. And you might say, well, imprisonment doesn't sound too bad. I mean, I've known people who've gone to jail and gotten out before. Imprisonment in a Roman jail is not the same as imprisonment here. If you were imprisoned, it was so that you would die. Okay, you would not be let back out. You weren't imprisoned in order to serve some time and then get out. You were imprisoned, and when you got out of there, you were led to die. And sometimes you died in prison. I don't know if you know this or not, but they didn't feed the prisoners. Okay, in those jails, if you didn't have somebody caring for you from outside the jail, you starved to death because they didn't supply you any clothing. They didn't supply you any food. If that didn't come from somebody on the outside, you were going to starve to death. And that's what's getting ready to go on in this. And then if you look at verses 8 through 11 again and notice this, but he talks about where that persecution comes from. It comes from the Jewish people. He says you are being persecuted, and the momentum for the stirring up of the authorities and everything else is actually coming from the synagogue that happens to be right there. Now, it's not unusual. It happened in Antioch in Acts chapter 13. It happened at Iconium in Acts chapter 14. It happened at Lystra in Acts chapter 14, verse 19. It happened at Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17. And so it's happening here as well. Why would Jews hate Christians like that? I'm just asking. Somebody give me some idea. Why would Jews be doing that to Christians? Anybody got a thought? I mean, they believe in the same God. So why would they be doing that? What do you think, Don?
I think a lot of them still go by the old law.
Yeah.
And Christians of quote Christ are going to follow the new law. And the Savior is Christ and not the old law.
Yeah. So, the lack of because I will just say this, most of the early Christians came out of the Jewish religion. Okay, not all of them, but most of them came out of the Jewish religion. So the Jewish people are losing members. I mean, their synagogue is losing members. And not only that, but those members who have left them are no longer offering the sacrifices every year, no longer keeping the feast every year. They're not doing any of those things. They're saying, no, in Christ we're freed from all of that. And that enrages them because, after all, they have the Old Testament. And remember, in the Old Testament, David said the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. They said, if it's perfect, why would you ever violate that? If the law of the Lord is perfect and we have it, then what you're doing has to be imperfect. That was their view. And so they stirred up persecution against them from that. And by the way, they helped to convince, this is I find interesting, they helped to convince the Roman authorities that Christians were atheists. And the reason they were atheists is they didn't worship any of the Roman gods, okay? Therefore, they must be atheists. That's who they are. And that was an anathema to the Roman people. And so it was under that. He calls them, in this case, a synagogue of Satan, okay? I find that interesting. Anybody know what Satan means? What's that? In this case, Satan means the person who is the accuser, okay? So he's the accuser. They're the synagogue of Satan because he's using them to accuse Christians of the things that they do. Remember when in the book of Job, the sons of God have all gathered before the throne of God and Satan comes in. And what does he do? The first thing, he accuses Job. You know, he accuses Job. God set him up. God said, have you considered my servant Job? He said, nah. Listen, just because you take care of him, he worships you. Take that away. He won't do that anymore. He's always the accuser. That's what he does. Satan is in the process of accusing us. Here's some of the slanders that came against the early Christians. When they said in the taking of the Lord's Supper, this is my body and this is my blood, the Jewish people said that means that Christians are cannibals. Okay? They're cannibals because they take the body and blood of Jesus, and so they must be cannibals. They're calling their common meal the agape meal that Christians almost always have. When they came together, they ate a meal. By the way, I'm just going to say this one, and you can take it for whatever it's worth. You don't have to agree with me on this. But in general, Christians would come together and they would eat a meal, and there wasn't necessarily a dismissal of the meal to go into the worship. As they were eating the meal, they took the Lord's Supper. Okay? That would be a part of it. And then it would go on into the rest of the worship. They didn't say, now that we've concluded our meal, we'll begin our worship. It just sort of flowed from one to the other. But because they call that meal the agape, the love feast, they accused Christians of orgies. That they were involved in orgies because obviously they were involved in love feasts. And then the other thing is that because some people, Jesus said, I didn't come to bring peace but a sword, and set a mother against her daughter-in-law and her daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and on and on and on he goes. They said Christians split up families. And so they're bad for society because Christians are tampering with family relationships. They're atheists because they don't worship the Roman gods. They're politically disloyal because they won't say Caesar is Lord. I thought that was interesting. The Jewish people weren't being persecuted for this. You know why? Because they did say Caesar is Lord. But they did it with a mental reservation that we believe in God, but it's okay to say Caesar is Lord because, in fact, the word Lord can mean a lot of things. And it did. You remember how the Bible says that Sarah honored Abraham in 1 Peter chapter 3 by calling him Lord? And he says, whose daughters you are if you follow the same pattern. I've been married to Beverly for 50 years. She has never called me Lord, okay? She doesn't do it. She doesn't call me Lord. But when you think about the way that Lord is used in Scripture, it's used sometimes of a king, sometimes of a slave owner, but it's also a word of just respect. That's all that it meant, was a word of respect. So that if you were meeting somebody that you wanted to show respect to, today we'd probably say Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. But then they would say Lord, okay? And they would say, I'm your servant, Lord. And that didn't mean that I think that you're my king. It just meant I'm showing you respect. So the Jews were able to say, yeah, he's Lord. But they meant in their heart, we just show him respect like you would to any king. That's what we're supposed to do. And so Caesar is Lord. Christians could have done the same thing. And they could have done it and been okay doing it. I'm just going to tell you. Christians could have done it and not died. They could have said Caesar is Lord. And in their heart of hearts, what they mean is that Caesar is king, and we're going to respect him as king. But they knew that the people who heard them would believe that they were worshiping Caesar. And so they said, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. And as a result of that, they end up being persecuted for it. Another thing, the Christians taught that the world will end in flames, that the world will burn up at the end. And so they accused them of being incendiaries. They accused them of being people who are, what do you call that, pyromaniacs. They said that that's who these people are. And so you have to do something about it. So anyway, that's what the church was under. So how would you like to be in this church, okay? First of all, you're under huge pressure. You have no money, and it's getting ready to get worse, okay? That's the town you're in. If you're looking for a town to settle in and say, I want to become a part of a really great church, this probably wouldn't have been the place you'd have picked, okay? It probably wouldn't have been the place that you picked. And yet, this is the church, one of the two churches for which Christ says no condemnation at all. No condemnation. The churches that he commends more than any else are the ones you probably wouldn't want to be a member of. The ones that don't seem like great churches. But they were great churches, but not from a human perspective, from God's perspective. I want you to look at how he describes himself. He says, I am the first and the last. Did you know that's a title that God accepted for himself in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 6, chapter 48. He says, I am the first and I am the last. In both those cases, God says that Jesus is claiming something that's really important, that he's God. One of the early heresies and one of the reasons for one of the early church conferences that took place was over the nature of Christ. Not in the New Testament, but a little bit later on. Because there was a prominent teacher who was teaching people that Jesus may be God, but he's not God like God. He's inferior to him. He's just really a great man, and therefore you can call him a God. And that was a heresy that the church met about. By the way, Dan Brown will tell you they met because they were afraid everybody was going to realize Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene and had this baby and all this. Which, by the way, that particular conference, if you go back and you look at that council that took place, they took copious notes, and those weren't even discussed. We know what they talked about in those. Dan Brown has a great book about it. It's a fiction, but it has nothing to do with the reality. Well, anyway, so he's the first and the last. So what does that mean for me? Well, what it means for me is that before I was, he is, okay? And no matter what happens to me, he is. And if he is, everything's going to be okay. No matter what happens to me, I'll be okay. But I think to the church or the people of Smyrna, the pagans of Smyrna, it also is a warning. I'm the first, and I will be here when you're gone. That's what he's telling them. So that's what's going on. He says that the second thing he says about Christ here, he says that he was dead and he's alive again. And I find that interesting because it says literally that he was dead and is alive. It is that he became dead and he is alive again. It describes something that is really important in that. He experienced the worst that life could give him, and he overcame it. And he's conquered the worst that life can do, and he lives. And if he conquered, you'll conquer too, and that's the story to the church. And then he says, I will give you the crown of life. I like that. What does that mean in the end? It's the crown that is life itself. In the Bible, there's all sorts of crowns that are talked about. In James chapter 1, verse 12, it's the crown of life. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8, it's the crown of righteousness. In the 1 Thessalonians, chapter 2, verse 19, it's the crown of boasting. It's the crown of glory in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 4. And then there's the crown that Paul talks about that the victors of the games got, laurel leaf, and he said that's a crown that they would receive for having won. It's the crown which consists of life, though in this case, it's the crown which is life itself. In the end, life. It's not about death. In the end, it's about life. We die to ourselves to live. It's not just about death. It's not just about giving up. It's about what I'm getting. And what I get in the end is life. That's what's happening to me in all of that. Well, let me just back up here for a second. I know I'm going out of my way to be, well, have you ever noticed when you really need your electronics to work, they don't? I want to go back here. Let me get back to it again. I had to restart some of this to get back. I'm always have this fear that's going to happen in the sermon. You know, actually has happened 2 or 3 times in some of my sermons, and I just have to go on without it, which Beverly says I should go without it anyway. But it would be helpful to me to always have something to look back on so that I don't go everywhere preaching the word or take 3 hours to do it. I told somebody sometime that preaching till midnight is biblical because Paul did it. And so if I preach to midnight, that should be okay. And I had an elder. What's that? Yeah, they'd fall out of the window when it happened. Yeah, there'd be a lot of people fall out if I preached till midnight. But the other thing, when I said that to an elder, I said, you know, it is biblical that I preach till midnight. He said, and remember that he was ready to depart on the morrow. He said, that will be what happens to you if you preach till midnight. Oh, boy. But look at the rest of this. He says, don't fear any of those things which are about to suffer. He's going to throw some of you in prison that you may be tested. You'll have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. And then he says, he who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. Some of them are going to die. Be faithful unto death. It doesn't mean be faithful up to the point of death, and then you don't have to be faithful anymore. It means be faithful up to and including death. Whatever's getting ready to happen to you, you make up your mind to be faithful. I love that because he didn't say be perfect till death. He didn't even say be righteous till death. He says be faithful. Okay? Those of you who've been married for any length of time, Beverly and I now 50 years, some of you longer than that, some of you less than that. But here's the thing about that. I can tell you that in 50 years, I have been a mess of a husband in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways. I've messed up all the time with all sorts of things. But I'm faithful, okay? I'm faithful to Beverly. Do I always listen like I should? No. I remember the year that for Valentine's Day, I got her a pressure cooker. Guys, there's a better thing to get her than that on Valentine's Day. I thought it would be great. For Christmas one year, I got her a vacuum cleaner. And I thought, well, that probably wasn't my best day. I can remember when we first got married and Beverly was running a day camp, actually, that went on all summer. And she had a little boy that was either going to be a mafia boss or president. We weren't sure which. But he was always giving her trouble. And she came in and she talked to me about it. She was almost crying. And she said, he does this, 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 and this, and he's driving me nuts. And I said, oh, listen, that's easy to solve. Here's what you do. And I gave her a 3-step process to fix it. And I went away thinking I was brilliant. She walked away thinking I was a jerk. Now, here's the reason. She didn't need my advice on how to fix it. She needed me to listen to know how she felt. And I didn't get that. I thought, okay, if I fix it, I'm good. No, I really didn't need to fix it. I just needed to listen. I needed to listen to what she was feeling as well as what she was saying. And I didn't do that very well. So I've messed up lots of times in my life. I can tell you that. Lost my temper when I shouldn't have. Not had a temper when I should have. I've had all sorts of things like that in the course of 50 years. But what matters is faithfulness in the end. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of life. I think sometimes we get so caught up in whether we're good enough. I just had somebody the other day who was dying who said, I need to talk to you. And so I talked with her. And she said, I hear people say they know they're going to heaven. And I can't say that. I can't say that. I'm not sure of that. She said, because I don't think I've been good enough. And I said, well, can I help solve that for you? And I mean, she was dying, literally dying. I said, can I help solve it for you? You haven't been good enough. There's no way you're good enough to go to heaven. But God's good enough to bring you there. And all he asks for you to do is to be faithful. He says, if you walk according to the Spirit and not according to the flesh, which means that the habit of your life is toward God and not toward something else, that you're saved. You're a Christian. You're saved. I said, you spent your life serving God. Have you been perfect? Absolutely not. And can you point out a lot of things where you messed up? Sure. I said, I can't. I think you're perfect. But you can say that, and you know that. But this isn't a matter of whether we're good enough. It's a matter of whether God's good enough, and he is, and whether we've just held on to it. And I said, and you're holding on to it. I mean, you've never let go. You're going to heaven. And she smiled and went to sleep, and I never talked to her again. That was the last I got to see her. On this side of eternity, it's the last. It wasn't perfection. It's faithfulness. Don.
I think as Christians, it's really hard to understand the grace of God.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It is. It really is. But if there's no grace, we're all in trouble. I mean, we really are. I know he said, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I've commanded you. I get that. And that's what we try to get people to do, is everything that he commands us. But all of us fall short, and all of us sin, and God's grace is there for us. And so be faithful unto death, and I'll give you that crown of life. And then he says on the next thing, he who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. Some of you are going to be hurt by the first death. Death itself hurts. For a lot of people, it does. I was very fortunate with both my parents. On the day that they died, they fell asleep and just breathed easily, never even did any of the death rattle or all the things that you see, never struggled, and just stopped breathing, and they were gone. That was it. They had the smoothest transition I think I've ever seen of anybody who's died. It was just this amazing transition without pain, which I was so thankful for. I was really, but that's not the common experience, okay? The common experience is that there's a lot of pain with it. Right now, Tommy Shearer is in the hospital. He lost his leg because, not through fault of his own, he was riding a motorcycle when a lawn care truck pulled out in front of him. And he hit it and went off, and his leg was degloved. I don't know if you know what that means, but it means all the skin was torn off his leg. And so they had to remove the leg. That's what happened to him with all of this. He's struggling. His left hand may not recover. It's in bad shape as well. There's a whole lot of things. There's a lot of pain with life and death. There's a lot of pain that happens. But you won't be hurt by the second death if you're faithful till death. The second death is the one that you read about later on in the book of Revelation. It's the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. It's where the devil and his angels are. It's where all of this is going to happen for people who were liars and fornicators and all the other things that he mentions in Revelation chapter 21, verse 8. The second death is this horrible place that Jesus describes as where the worm doesn't die and the fire isn't quenched, where it's described as outer darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's a terrible thing. But you don't have to go there. If you're faithful, you don't have to go there. You're not going to be hurt by the second death. Now then, here's my question. I don't even know what time it is. Oh, man. Our time is just about over here. Are we like this church? I can tell you that we're not like the church in that we're not poverty-stricken. We've been blessed at Creve Hall. We've been blessed with people who, I remember the worst times that I've seen here financially was following 2008 and the financial meltdown where 1 out of every 10 of our employable members was out of work. It was a difficult time. Pat Wagoner and Ted Burrell started a transitions ministry of helping people find work, and everybody that came found work except for one lady that they said they wouldn't have hired themselves. But everybody else found work, and I don't just mean flipping hamburgers. If they were a vice president of a company, they found an equal position in another company. It was amazing what they did. But those were difficult financial times, and even then, we weren't poverty-stricken. okay? Even then, we were blessed. I mean, incredibly blessed. We aren't like them that way. Are we under the kind of persecution they were under? And the answer to that is no, we're really not. You know, when we talk about persecution, it might be somebody saying, so you're a Christian, huh? Well, and we go, oh, I've been persecuted. And they're saying, are you kidding me? You know, we're being put in prison and killed. So we don't have anything like what they had. And I pray that we don't, by the way. I hear some people every once in a while say what the church needs to purify it and to find its mission again is a lot of persecution. That may be true, but I am never going to be praying for that, okay? I'm just not going to be praying for that. If God chooses to do that, then that's his choice, but I'm thankful that we're not right there. But here's where I want to know if we are like they were. Are we faithful like they were? Okay? They didn't give up, no matter what happened to them. They didn't give up. I see people every once in a while that get upset with the decision the elders have made, and they say, we're going somewhere else. Or we're just going to give up, okay? Is that the way we're supposed to be? It's not. I remember one guy that would come to me and said, I walked through the lobby, and so-and-so passed me by and never said a word to me. I can't believe they are just so disrespectful of me as a person. And I would talk to him. He did this about every week. He would come in and be upset with somebody who had passed him and didn't say hi. And what I would tell him at the end of the week is, you know what? You're not the most important person to a whole lot of folks. And you're not even supposed to be the most important person to you. Who did you speak to in that lobby? What did you do to make a difference in that lobby? And I said, you got to realize a lot of people have a whole lot of stuff in their head that's been happening to them all week, and they're not seeing people when they're walking through there. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's just the way it is, and you shouldn't get upset. Go talk to them. Ask them how they're doing. Ask them if something's going on with them. Do that. But he was so convinced that people were disrespecting him and all of that. And so eventually he quit coming. Okay, they were just because they were disrespecting him. Can you imagine in this church where they're under pressure, poverty-stricken, they're holding on to each other because that's all they have, okay? That's all they have, and they're not about to let go. Who are you going to turn to if you let go of each other? There's nobody else. So I remember Marshall Keeble one time saying that the white man hates me because of the color of my skin, and the black man hates me because of the gospel that I preach. Where could I go but to the Lord? That was what he said. Where can we go but to each other in the Lord? That's where we go. Are we like this church? I don't want to have to find out. I'm just telling you, I really don't want to have to find out. If we got in those circumstances, maybe we would be faithful like that. And I prayed that we would be. I know that many would be. I think one of the things that happens in a church like this is that you take out the people who are going in for social position and business connections because they didn't have any. Okay, they just didn't have any. You're not there for that. I always thought Beverly had to love me because she surely didn't marry me for looks or money. So she had to love me. You have to love each other because they're not there for the social advancement. They're not there for any other reason than holding on to each other and helping each other get to heaven. And I hope that we're like that. Anybody got any thoughts about that? I know our time is up, but anybody have any thoughts about that or anything? Do you think we are like them in their faithfulness or not? What do you think, Mike?
I think we're doing fairly well. We can always improve.
Okay. Yeah, all of us can improve, that's for sure. But I hope so. I hope we are. And if we are, then we can weather anything.
I guess you're going to ask what the question is, define faith and where the church is. And maybe Mike referring more to Creek Hall. Yes, we are here at Creek Hall. But I don't know if we can say that of all churches of Christ across this country.
Yeah.
Because then you get to are we following God's word? It's been compromised in a lot of churches.
Yes, it has. You know what? Here's the thing that hurt us. I think, I don't know. Do y'all remember, if you've been in the church for a long time, do you remember the old gospel advocates back from the 50s and 60s and even early 70s that there was a whole section in the back of the Gospel Advocate about works that were going on, and preachers would send in reports. I just held a gospel meeting. We had 30 baptisms. Praise God, all of this was going really good. And that was a common thing. And we had this sense of brotherhood about us, that we were doing something that was really good. And then several among us began to decide that there were those who were false teachers, and they began publishing papers. One of them that started it, and then several that followed through with it afterwards, about all the false teachers in our brotherhood and what was wrong with them. And having experienced some of that firsthand, I can just tell you, in talking with the guys who published those papers, it was more a rumor mill than it was anybody actually knowing what was going on. But it developed a sense of fear and anger and distrust among us, where we lost this sense that we're a brotherhood. We lost that. And then we decided we weren't going to worry about what the papers were going to put up about us, because we weren't going to read their papers anyway. And we just started doing our own thing. And every congregation started talking about how we are autonomous, and it's true, we are, that we're autonomous. And so we'll do what we want to do, you do what you want to do, write us up if you want to, it doesn't matter. We're going to do what we want to do. And some churches have done very well, and some have not done so well. But we've lost this precious thing of brotherhood, of a common cause. We are a people who are making a difference in our generation. We've lost that sense that that's what we're doing as a body, not just as a local body, but as a body of God's people. And sometimes there's a balance that has to be struck. Sometimes we need to care enough about other congregations that we sit down with them and talk to them and give them the opportunity to see things differently. And I hope we do that. I want us to do that. But I don't want to start a campaign of who's faithful and who's not all around us, because then we end up back in that same vicious cycle we were in before. So as my mother used to say, we look to our own knitting first, and then we have the opportunity to do something good with other people, and that's what we should do. One of the things that I love about our Connect conference coming up is that it unites a whole lot of churches to do a whole lot of good. And we need to have opportunities like that. So I'm thankful we have the chance to host it. We're not the ones who necessarily put it together. I want y'all to know that. But we participate in the putting of it together, and we host it, and it's good for us. So plan on being here when we do our Connect conference. It'll be a great thing. Let's have a prayer before we go. And Don, lead us in that prayer.
Dear Father, we thank you for this day, for the opportunity we can open up your word and study and learn about some of the churches in the past. And we pray, Heavenly Father, that we always keep on the straight and narrow path, and that is following your word. We ask, Heavenly Father, that you be with this congregation, that we always realize that we need to strive to open up our eyes and our hearts to help others in need. Be with us as we begin this week. We're so thankful for what we have, especially the health. We pray we never take that for granted. Christ, we pray.
Amen. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. So if you want to know where we go next, just look at the next church. Hey, how are you doing?